This is such an intimate space that it's kind of a laugh riot that with these lights in my face, I honest to God can't even see you, even though we're this close together. But I'm thrilled that you are here. So my name's Garth Ross. I'm the Vice President for Community Engagement here at the Kennedy Center. And I know a lot of you here in the room tonight. I don't know all of you here in the room tonight. And part of what this is about getting to know each other and continuing to do our work together. So for anyone I've not met, please come up and say hi afterwards. Tonight is the next installment, or the current installment, the third, in the ArtChangeUS at the Kennedy Center National Conversation Series. And ArtChangeUS is an incredible initiative based out of Cal Arts, led by an incredible leader in the arts field named Roberta Uno, looking at the rapid demographic change in the US and what that means for culture and what that means for cultural institutions. And it's great to be able to work with Roberta and Capenna and their colleagues at ArtChangeUS. It's also great to be able to work with them right now at the Kennedy Center. We have an extraordinary president, Deborah Rutter, who is very, very focused on the role of arts in society, the important role that it plays, motivating positive change. Obviously, also the central role that artists play in that. So this idea that's probably obvious to all of you, but maybe not to everyone in the world, that artists are profound leaders who imagine everything into existence. Everything that we have, everything that we do, from the pens we write with, to the buildings that we walk by, to of course, the music that we sing, and the art we enjoy is imagined first by artists. So artists are indeed leaders. So this whole conversation series being one that is entirely artist-led, these dialogues at the intersection of arts and social justice are really an opportunity for us to use the Kennedy Center as a platform to lift up these artists and these ideas and these important dialogues. So again, we're really thrilled you're here. Speaking of dialogue, before I turn it over to Capenna, I just want to point to the note cards on your table. So if, as folks have questions in their own mind, go ahead and write them down, and just hold one up if you write down a question. Someone from our staff will go grab it, and we will discreetly hand it to our discussants, who will work answering those questions expertly into the flow of the conversation. But we really want to hear what you are interested in as well, what inspires you about the conversation, or what troubles you that you'd like to hear their take on. And I also issue that same invitation to the folks who are visiting us with the live stream. But with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Capenna Alapai.
Thank you. Thank you guys again for being here. Give yourself another round of applause, please. Thank you so much. My name is Capenna Alapai. I'm the Project and Development Coordinator for Arts in a Changing America. Like Garth was saying, it is a initiative based out of California Institute of the Arts that bring together artists, activists, change makers, idea producers, that bring together all of these people to discuss this demographic shift of the US and its profound impact on arts, culture, and social justice. But it's really amazing to be working with the Kennedy Center on this, and our partners, Robert Van Leer, Garth Ross, Ariel Shelton, Bobby Hunter. Thank you guys for making these possible. It's really amazing that the level of commitment that the Kennedy Center has shown to prioritizing narratives like this in a real effort to change things, to change organizations, to change individuals, to change arts organizations, large, small, grassroots, grass tops, all of us, in one room, at one conversation. So please do your part to share these conversations. Make sure that we keep coming to these, make sure that we keep streaming these, so that these conversations can go on from year to year. But with that said, we're going to introduce our discussants. Our first discussant, Favianna Rodriguez, is an Oakland-based multimedia artist, CEO and founder of Culture Strike, and recent Robert Rauschenberg Fellowship awardee. So with that, we're going to bring on Favianna. And Paul D. Miller, yes. And our next discussant, Paul Miller. I'm gonna move back where I was. Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky, is a composer, an artist, an activist whose multimedia performance piece, Rebirth of a Nation, screens tomorrow. So please do your part, spread that word. Let's get these tickets sold. Let's get people into this amazing, amazing event happening tomorrow night. With that, we're going to bring up Washington, D.C. born artist Paul Miller.
All right, rock and roll. Hey, everybody. So, hey, Favianna, how you doing? So, first and foremost, I just want to say what a pleasure and treat it is to meet you and to just share a beautiful, intimate space. Let's call this like a living room session.
Yeah, I love it.
So, let's unpack some of the things we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Recently, she was telling me you had started a social innovation lab with the writer Jeff Chang, and then also that you've been setting up a people of color camp at Burning Man, about as different as you could possibly imagine. So let's connect some dots here. Tell me about Peru versus Oakland versus here.
Yeah, so my family's from Peru. I'm actually Afro-Peruvian, and I think one thing that's just really interesting is that most of slavery actually happened in Mexico and in Peru, and I think that as Latinx people, we often don't understand our own history of blackness. So I grew up in thank you. I grew up in a Peruvian family. I was born in Oakland and being, raised in Oakland, the Panthers, and I grew up in the 80s, which was when Oakland was still like super, super hood, and yet, very strong kind of immigrant mixed status family. So I had a lot of people who were coming from Peru who didn't have papers. And in the 90s, you began to see a really anti-immigrant sentiment in all of California. So for me, I think, growing up in a very black and brown city, understanding the way racism worked in Oakland in the United States, but also understanding how it worked through colonialism, right, in Peru, because my father, as a Afro-Peruvian man, never acknowledged that he was black, and neither did my grandmother. And so just kind of understanding the layers of how colonialism and racism work, and then growing up wanting to be an artist, I think was just a really interesting mix. Mm-hmm. So how about you? I mean, tell me about what it was like growing up here in DC.
Okay. Well, but by way of transition, what we're seeing is one of Favianna's wonderful paintings, and I'm going to kind of intersperse some images throughout the conversation to highlight the spoken with the visual, because I think it's really important to think not just about the conversation, but the dimensionality that a conversation can evoke. So when I think of art and music, and I think of technology and design, Washington, D.C. has a very surreal place. I'm sure many of you have seen the David Adjaye Museum, the African American History Museum. So I grew up near here, over near DuPont Circle, and also up near Shepherd Park. And amusing enough, my mother was a kind of historian of design, and she had a store called Toast and Strawberries at DuPont Circle at Connecticut and R. So I used to spend a lot of my time at that area. This is my mom's hand-drawn logo from 1972. And so DuPont Circle at that time was a group of really idealistic people who had all been involved with cultural, sort of dynamic engagements with politics. So you had Food for Thought, which was a legendary vegetarian restaurant. You had Kramer Bookstore. And let me show you, this is my family from 1972. That's DuPont Circle, 1972. And my mom's wearing a dress from a traditional Indian design. And she had this whole idea of women and design and changing the world with how women would innovate. And her most recent book is called Threads of Time, I think 400 Years of Women Designers. So when I was growing up in DC, there was 2 or 3 layers of things going on. One, you had the federal government, and 2, you had this whole issue of like statehood representation. So we don't have senators, we barely have congressional representation, and on top of that, we're run out of a senatorial kind of colonial fiefdom. So in fact, when I was a kid, the license plates would say "taxation without representation." And anybody remember those? Right?
I think they still exist.
Right. So when I'm speaking ironically there, but how we think about art and design and the contemporary imagination, let's look at hip hop versus go-go. And when I was a kid, I was into punk and dub, and so hip hop and go-go were the dominant narrative in DC at that time. And there was a club called Kilimanjaro over at Florida near Adams Morgan. And that was a heartbeat of where a lot of reggae would come through town. So I went to go see bands like Black Uhuru on one hand.
Wow, I
And
love that.
oh yeah, and then on the other hand, you'd go to a place like Food for Thought, and you'd be able to see people like Bad Brains hanging out, or Minor Threat, which is a legendary punk group. So for me at least, it was always like, you know what, there's a lot of people from different walks of life. Everyone reads books, which for America, as we know, is like, and there's a lot of smart, interesting people from radically different walks of life. My dad was dean of Howard University's law school in the 60s, and so I grew up with that sense of idealism informing my work. And one of his main cases, he was a lawyer with Angela Davis, and she, to this day, remains a sort of an associate and family friend. But the eerie thing about the way DC was at that time is that there was a very progressive black intact movement of families, doctors, lawyers, and so on. You know, it was a middle class aesthetic, but on the other end of the spectrum, you know, there was a lot of progressive politics. And I produced, I don't know if anyone has seen the film with Saul Williams, Slam. Anybody seen Slam? Okay, well, do some due diligence. It's a great film set in the jails of DC. I produced the score for that, and Saul Williams is a really renowned hip hop MC. And we got a chance to get into some of the prisons, which for me, as a middle class person, growing up in DC, is like fearful. Don't mess with anything. You do not want to mess with the prisons. And we even got Mayor Marion Barry to be a judge in the film, and he sentences Saul to jail for smoking weed. So it was a quite ironic film. But when this film was being shot, I saw a section of DC I had never even, I just grew up in a very intact, relatively pleasant household. We went to Jamaica every summer because my mom was an art critic for the Kingston Daily Gleaner, if anybody knows that, Jamaica. So pleasant, relaxed lifestyle, but also very politically engaged. So when I saw the prisons, I realized that there was an entire dimension. 50% of African American males between the age of 18 and 35 were either in jail or on parole when I was growing up. And those statistics are powerful. But on the other hand, if you have parents who are very concerned with that, critique of the prison system, that is a legacy I kind of was always thinking about. Is like, what is the psychology that makes people interact with this prison industrial system? And it's a black-run city, a predominantly African-American population, and still the jails were packed with,
Right.
And we had a huge murder rate, crack, and so on.
Well, I mean, that was Oakland as well. I mean, I grew up, I remember growing up with the Panthers, just the feeling of black power all around us, and yet California was leading in incarceration. And interestingly, Oakland, I remember seeing the effects of crack and cocaine, the epidemic, and gangs in my hood. And just to think that in the 90s, I remember when I was coming home from school and I would just always be watching my back. And now we're in one of the most expensive cities in the country. And just to see the way in which people have been pushed out. And, interestingly for me, art was a way to have a voice, because I remember in high school especially, I think it happens between junior high and high school, where you realize how much kids of color are being tracked, and they're definitely not being put into the college-bound track. But luckily, there was, Chicano muralists in my hood, and who really...
That's some of your art?
Yeah, oh yeah, so that's one of my... That's one of my pussy power pieces.
You got to walk us through that one.
Yes, I'll walk you through that. So, I grew up in an immigrant family, and I would always hear narratives of fear-based narratives, right? Which is, don't be out at night, close your legs, don't get pregnant, don't get an STD. And I think that as a daughter of immigrants, my parents definitely didn't want me to be an artist. They said they did not immigrate here for me to be an artist, and they definitely didn't like when I dropped out of UC Berkeley on a full scholarship. But the reason I dropped out is actually because I got pregnant, and I decided to have an abortion, and I was in the closet about my abortion for 10 years. And one of the reasons why I came out not only was because there was such, we are in an era of anti-choice legislation. And when I say that, I mean, we're looking at over 1,000 pieces of legislation introduced a year against a woman's choice to can have a baby or not. And so what I realize as an artist is that, there is so much pain-based narratives. There's always about, don't do this, don't do that, or even in our movements, we say, no to incarceration, no to deportation, no war. And I think that we lack pleasure-based narratives. And for me as an artist, I wanted to see the joy and the pleasure of life. And so when I finally came out about my abortion, in order to change laws, because the reason I came out was to shed stigma, because 1 in 3 women in this country have abortion, and yet we live under a culture of shame and stigma. And it was important for me to look at the opposite of that, which is pleasure. And which is that I remember growing up in a Catholic school and I only learned about the vagina and your uterus and your fallopian tubes. I never learned about the clitoris, and yet the clitoris is the source of pleasure. And I'm just like, what the hell? We are in an education system that completely disconnects us from pleasure and that has a reproductive centric lens. And for me as a Latina and the daughter of immigrants, which, you know, people think, oh, Latinos are so conservative, or which, you know, unfortunately, yes, many of our family members are conservative, but that's exactly why I'm an artist, because I felt just the need to be free, and this piece is called Deliberate Orgasm. And I would notice that I would go around the country talking about my abortion and, you know, Planned Parenthood. Everyone was like, oh, you know, here's the story. And I was like, you know, people want to hear more about my pain narratives than they do about my pleasure narratives. And so I decided to really switch it up and to talk about that pleasure and joy are such a key part of our humanity. And I think that racism makes us believe that we don't deserve that, or we live in a productivity-oriented culture, which is, if you grew up in an immigrant family, it's like you work. You're only here because you're valuable as a productive body. And that's just not true, because we are human beings and we are on this earth to feel our bodies and to experience what it's like to be a human being. So that's why I create work like this, which, you know, Deliberate Orgasm, as you can imagine, there's, in addition to an economic gap, there's an orgasm gap in this world. And so I wanted to really, you know, talk about, I wanted to use my art as like a way to disrupt everything I've ever learned, and even to criticize some of the ways that I had grown up, which I think are still, you know, ultra-Catholic product of colonialism.
Okay. Well, I mean, in that same context, I want to show a situation for some of the art that inspires me as well. A little while ago, I took a studio to Antarctica and went to several of the main ice fields. And the basic premise was to do acoustic portraits of ice. And
Wow.
for me, at least, Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government. And so the whole notion of you get off a ship, and we chartered a Russian icebreaker, and essentially was doing photography, and it was, you know, this is me walking on thin ice there, you know, I'm seeing, you can see the cracks underneath my feet. The eerie thing about governance and the self and the subject is that these are things that we have a choice to critique, right? And I think the arts are one of the most powerful tools the left doesn't use as powerfully as it could.
Exactly.
So here we are at Kennedy Center, which is, you know, one of the epicenters of power and commerce and culture. And for me, at least, it's a pleasure to kind of think about that for my film project, which is going to be presented tomorrow. One of my other projects was called The Rebirth of a Nation. I'm sure many of you saw Birth of a Nation, the Turner film, but I did it first, sorry. And Public Enemy also, they named their album after mine. I don't know if anyone remembers Public Enemy's album, Rebirth of a Nation. So this film is set in it's made in 1915, it's now 2017, and we've had almost 100 years of media and propaganda as the idea of racial politics in cinema and the roles that people can play based on, you know, what I call management of expectations. So if you're expected to be, you know, ignorant or a lawyer or a doctor or a quantum physicist or whatever, then those expectations can very much cloud the way you think about self and self-esteem and the ability to move the envelope and change the narrative. So that's something I think we really have in common.
Totally.
One of the funnest parts of that project for Birth of a Nation, which hope you guys all come out tomorrow, is we got a chance to present it at the Acropolis in Greece, and we had about 5,000 people come to the show, and I projected this crazy KKK remix, and the Greek government was like, but why do you want to play a KKK film at the Acropolis? And I was like, you know, you guys are Greek, you got comedy, tragedy, and they're like, oh, we get it, okay.
Yes.
You know, so the funny thing about DJing is a lot of the early DJs would call themselves Grandmaster Flash or Grand Wizard Theodore, and they didn't know that those were also KKK titles. So if you have a Grand Wizard in Kentucky versus a Grand Wizard in the South Bronx, I'll leave it at that. So you go to this crazy theater at the base of the Acropolis, And this is one of a very ancient theater, and we put a huge sound system throughout the ruins. And so I'm DJing, I'm like, hey everybody, this is one of the earliest symbols of theater in the West. And you have to imagine, to me, this is a theater of sound, with hip hop, with techno, dubstep, DJing. You're playing with voices and potentiality. So the ability to transform and remix something is not just about sound, but about life, And so I think that that's what tonight's about as well, and it's been a real pleasure. So I want to ask you, speaking of pleasure, why painting? Because that's a very 19th century, 18th century. What's the 21st century update?
Well, I actually don't paint because I can't stand painting,
Okay.
I can't.
Okay.
It's too. I work a lot on paper and I work on layering. Yes, thank you. And for me, actually, why it is that I became a visual artist is because I remember growing up seeing Emory Douglas's work. Emory Douglas, the Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party, and also I grew up in the Bay Area, so visual culture was all around, like anti-war stuff, marijuana stuff, Grateful Dead. I mean, I grew up with so much visual imagery that presented another kind of lifestyle, and for me, disrupting the visual narrative was so critical. And one thing is, when I was growing up in Oakland, things got so bad. I remember, it was just, I remember being almost shot at, and I was like, I need to get out of Oakland, and so I asked my mom to send me to Mexico City. And when I went to Mexico City, it was the first time that I was educated on the muralists and even Aztec culture, and really understanding, as a Latina, just the power of our African and indigenous heritage. And so if you notice in my work, I really want to accentuate who we are as people, just a beautiful, glorious people that, unfortunately, conquest and invasion of the Spanish just eliminated so much of what was happening on this land base. So for me, the visual language, and because being surrounded by politics, so much of my work has words in it, because that was an aesthetic that really spoke to me. The political posts, and most of my works are actually paper-based, because many of the artists in whether it was the Taller de Gráfica Popular in Mexico, or a lot of the poster movement, the free speech movement in Berkeley, Black Power through the newspapers, so much was paper-based. And it was paper-based because the painting was just one. And paper allowed you to have a multiple. And for me, having a multiple is where the power is, because you get to distribute the same object in multiple formats, rather than it being a singular work of art.
Okay. Now, again, just as
totally.
a response on that,
riffing.
so we go from ancient Greece on up to some of the issues that I think animate our time, which is climate. And so for me,
yes.
When you talk about climate, it's different than weather. That's one thing I always want to make sure people kind of really differentiate. And one of my favorite events recently, this is when I DJ'd Earth Day. We had about 200,000 people, and that's just a couple blocks from here. And so I'm DJing, and the whole concert, it was me, The Roots, the Flaming Lips. I don't know if anyone knows these bands, who knows? But the fun part about DJing that was I made the whole set based on the sound of ice. So all the beats, all the bass lines, the electronic riffs. So I want to play you guys. One of the things that to me is really important when you're thinking about art and sound is I've worked with artists and been inspired by artists. Like, say for example, this is Chuck D from Public Enemy. Me and him did an album together called Drums of Death, where we got the drummer from Slayer. I don't know if anybody, again, Slayer is like, so it was a funny thing to go from that to, I've also worked with artists like Ai Weiwei. To me at least, it's incredibly important to think about the way design informs intent. So for example, this last election, when you're talking about design, you have to think about the collision between code and culture. So say for example, there's a new term that a lot of people in the theory world are using, what you call computational propaganda. So Trump, for example, is a walking algorithm. He's not a human being. I mean, that orange wig gives it away, right? And to me, at least, the eerie thing about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those things is that the artist has now moved from the palette of paint to the palette of code. So what I'm doing, and this is, I think we have some resonance here, is thinking about that from the viewpoint of nature. So when you see a piece of ice, this is actually a very specific mathematical, it's what you call hexagon shape. And if you see a piece of ice, it's actually permutation of hexagonal form. You can easily see that, right? 6 sides, hexagon. And then you see a permutation, same but different, same but different. So too with electronic music. If you hear certain rhythms and patterns, you're actually hearing a similar tempo, but you'll have a lot of innovation because they have a very strict rule set. 4/4 tempo, certain duration of beats and tones. And if you keep going, it gets deeper and deeper. So with electronic music and paint and sculpture and the arts in general, one of my favorite metaphors is that we have to think about this idea of constant innovation. And that's, again, I think we share in common is a radical unwillingness to accept things the way they are. And so, for example, with the ICE project, I ended up doing a book out of that called The Book of Ice. And we had it, every page in the book was different kind of equations that I had taken from different mathematicians about ice. And we had a premiere at Sundance hosted with Robert Redford. And basically you went into the gallery and there was different kinds of ice melting. And the ice would make a song out of the melting of the water and other things when you hear ice dripping and stuff like that. So I always think that it's important to really say, it doesn't need to be this way. You wake up in the morning and it's like people have just put a prison on their head and just taken the key and locked it and thrown away the key, you know, but that's the Matrix, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, yeah, so what do you think of art and potential right now? Because I think we're in a really interesting time where there's so many routes to express and to innovate.
Well, I'm so glad you talked about climate change because, you know, for me, I think that many of us, when we think of racial justice, you know, that's actually one of my climate change pieces. This one is called Defend Your Home, Defend Your City, Defend Your Planet, because we only have one home, and it's Earth. And I think that, you know, the environmentalism movement has failed in that it has really failed to engage the people in the front lines. I mean, you know, in my hood in Oakland, if you look at the air quality and the water quality, we are on the scale of 80%, meaning we have 80% like toxins in the air because we're by a freeway. So I will live 12 years less than someone in the hills because of the effects of environmental destruction. And for me, I think that one thing that's, and, you know, I think even climate change is such a like weird word because it has no emotion to it. It doesn't really mean much, but really what it is that the way that we use energy is unsustainable. Americans use 17 times more energy than anyone else in the world. We are addicted to fossil fuels. And I think that, you know, as an artist, I always love to think about the imagination, right? And like what is possible. And right now, I think that we can't even imagine a world without our cars or without our speed or without our electricity. And more than that, we are so reliant on fossil fuels, on oil. And so, you know, I just went solar in my home. I just got all solar panels. I drive an electric vehicle. And I've been really thinking about what will it take for us to imagine a future where we use renewable energy. And that is something that is almost, you know, because I think our communities, you know, we're fighting against police brutality. We're fighting against deportation. And I think that often we're not integrating the understanding of how also what's happening to our planet is we're in the front lines of that. I mean, communities of color are the ones who suffer most, whether it's through food deserts or through the quality of the air, the quality of the water. I mean, Flint, Michigan, Louisiana, it's ground zero for climate change and #1 prison state. So I'm really, I'm so excited that we're both, you know, working in climate, but also, which is, I think, at the foundation, at least for me, is to reconnect with the natural world. And, you know?
No, so let's unpack that because I think it's important to think about the way the West has divorced the body from the mind on one hand and then divorced the city from nature. Yes. So the eerie thing is when you go back to the ancient Greeks, you go back to other kinds of contemporary but also historical narrative, one of the things that's fascinating about growing up in DC is it's based on essentially a rationalist grid. You know, the whole city is a grid that was designed by a specific group of French architects, L'Enfant and so on. So when you look at architecture, there's a very famous phrase where they say architecture is nothing but frozen music. And that's from the German poet Goethe. But I love to remix that and say, you know, music is nothing but liquid architecture. So when you start, this is one of my favorite images. This is considered the first sound system. This is from 1915. it's this group of artists called the Italian Futurists. So the gentleman on the left is Luigi Russolo, the guy with the mustache. And so he said the future will be about the sound of the city coming out of these speakers and just deal with it. You know, so they would have these futurist concerts. And as artists, it was considered controversial because the audience would come and they say, hey, where's the band? You know, and so basically they'd start throwing bottles at them and say, hey, where's the music? It's in Italy, so where's the musica? You know, and you know, so he said, hey, you know, the future is all going to be sound coming out of these speakers from wherever the speaker is. Just, it doesn't matter where the band is because the band and the city and the reflections of time are coming out of sound. So, you know, this the controversy, amusingly enough, you can see who won. You see these speakers right here. So the artists always have a kind of nonlinear relationship to society. And so the Birth of a Nation project, which again, I want to make sure everyone feels very comfortable tomorrow. We're having this as a kind of a remix of Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. And for me, at least, I just want to assure everybody out there, I can assure you I'm not a KKK member, just putting that out there. And so my own graphic design work, I usually been doing a critique of these ideas around the logo of the nation. And so when I say logo, again, going back to the ancient Greek, the idea of logos was like the overriding sort of structure, the DNA of it. So with my own graphic design work and the sort of puns that go into it, much of it is about appropriation and collage. But let's go back to one other thing. I just want to show you a quick image here. This is considered the first record cover sleeve. It was designed by Alex Steinweiss in the early 1920s. This is his studio in the 1920s, and you can see a couple of things at work here. It's a graphic score, you know, square, very specific rule set. It had to be a square. And if you went to a record store in the 1920s and 30s, you would see basically a blank gray sleeve. And so you'd have to go in and say, hey, I want to play this one song, and you wouldn't be able to play it yourself. You'd have to ask the clerk. So one day he went into Columbia Records and said, why don't we put an image on the cover to give people an idea of what the song sounds like? So he invented the record cover sleeve, which essentially did a revolution in graphic design. So you have to imagine everything that you've seen, every song you've heard, you can actually think of the album cover, or for that matter, the graphics that go with it. But if we dial out to 2017, I'm just going to hit a button here, and you can easily see the relationship to apps. So the graphic design of an app is essentially giving you a sense of what the sound or the image or the text or the interface is about. So I developed iPad apps. This is a turntable app I've done. I'm just going to do a quick demo, and then we'll, because I know time is, you know. Can we get more volume here?
Around for this brand new 5 people gather around for this brand new song I'm putting down. Sit tight and listen keenly. Run that.
All right, so if I want to remix this, I'm just going to do a quick remix. Why not? So any of these can be transformed. So let's try another one because I think that might work a little better just because it's a better beat mix. And if I want to just do this really quick to show you.
This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new value. When all is ready, I throw this switch.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume.
So that was just And so those are files. I mean, they're everything from how you think about audio format on up to having access to Google, SoundCloud, Spotify, Google Music, iTunes, and having access to millions and millions of songs that I can pull from iTunes straight onto the app that I just made. So when you start thinking about having access to millions and millions of songs has radically changed the way we think about this, going back to the record. And that means you have a displacement of the live experience. Most people have now experienced culture through YouTube or what you call sort of sound discovery channels like SoundCloud, Spotify, and so on. Meanwhile, so too with images. And I think that's what our common ground here is that we're now dealing with the politics of spectacle, how we start to think about transforming a society with the arts. I just want to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, it's so interesting. I just came from New York, and today's Monday, and yesterday I got an award for theater, for political theater, and I had never quite imagined myself as a performer, but then I realized that so much of the work that I do as an artist is about performance and performing in the city or performing a space, and this is a very critical piece. Migration is beautiful around, the monarch butterfly, for example, migrates from Mexico through the US and Canada. And all species actually migrate. Migration is in our DNA. We are human beings, we've always moved, and borders are fairly new concept in the history of the earth and in the history of humanity. And so I wanted to use the metaphor of the butterfly as a metaphor for immigrants, because immigrants are also pollinators. Immigrants bring ideas, and they literally are growing your food, right? So they are pollinators. You require them in order to have a food industry. Immigrants are usually you see them throughout restaurants and definitely throughout our food economy, whether it's agriculture or the meat and poultry industry. And I wanted to show, because we live in we've had an anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, and now globally for the last 15, 20 years, and even under Obama, we were looking, under the Obama administration, we were deporting over 1,100 migrants a day. So Obama set up the current, deportation apparatus that 45 is leveraging. But this piece is particularly about how migration is in our DNA, and migration is our human right, and that we all have the liberty to move. And we also did just get some questions, so I guess I'll hand you this, and I'll start off with this one, which is Marianne on FB says, I know you do a lot of work with women. Can you talk about this now in the context of the current administration? Well, I mean, I think that I think that we are continuing in a world of patriarchy, in the sense where we continue to live in a rape culture, we continue to live in an anti-choice culture, and globally there is a huge problem. I mean, human trafficking is the second largest illegal industry in the world. And so for me, of course, as a feminist and as a woman, I've always tried to position ourselves from a place of power, and not just from a place of experiencing oppression, but also from a place of knowing our power, and also really fundamentally understanding that in order to change the world, I mean, if you go to some of these climate conferences, there's hardly any women. And I'm like, you know what is being under the global administration of men really is a huge issue. I mean, we have the largest ever divide of the economic gap ever. We have war, we have the destruction of the planet, and this has happened under men's rule. So I think to myself, why have the data is all there? Like, men in power have definitely not led us down a good road, and we need a huge shift in power. And I definitely think we need women and queer folks and trans folks at the table, and young people at the table to decide policy. So I would say I haven't really, I haven't necessarily changed as much of what I do insofar as continuing to lead through a power lens and a pleasure lens too, because I think that no matter how hard it feels, we need to have fun and connect and love each other and just experience our humanity.
Wow, just a riff on that. So I think people are snapping there. The eerie thing about pleasure versus pain versus society is that capitalism creates artificial scarcity.
Yes.
And you always have to feel that you need more, right? Like more, more. So we're using up resources, we're using up the psychology and the emotions and all these things that would sustain a creative and sustainable society overall. But the eerie thing is that without any sense of self-reflection, and that's where we need maybe new mirrors to hold up to society. And I think that this is where, again, sound and art and this kind of idea of the politics of perception come home to roost. For me, at least, when I hear what you're talking about, one of the things that really strikes me is, like, I remember this image of, the kind of Abu Ghraib. I'm sure many of us remember this from the ancient early 2000s. And when I think about art and society and design, I mean, I'm just going to show you a quick ironic image here. But this is a remix of Obama and Bush. Just
Wow.
you just sort of no.
Wow.
I'm just I'm just putting this out there. But the idea here is that having this sense of a visual vocabulary and being able to dismantle the power of perception and the sort of media trance means that we actually, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Instagram, all of these are kind of a media trance. They just put people in this idea that they're turning their life inside out. In fact, we have more surveillance on ourselves now through social media than the Stasi or the communists in Russia or China would have ever been able to do, because everyone's just making themselves completely, transparent, putting every aspect of their life online. And it's being monetized, and the largest corporations now, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, and of course Microsoft, the Furious Five. So when you start to look at that from the viewpoint of, imagine one day if you woke up and said, I want to get rid of one of those out of my life. Would you be able to give up Apple? Would you be able to give up Facebook? Would you be able to give up Google? Would you be able to give up Microsoft? Personally, Facebook would be the first to go for me. And then the last, because I have all these Apple devices, it'd be a little hard, yeah. But I always try and think about, this is like, I'm a big fan of William S. Burroughs, the writer, and the beat poet movement in general. And one of my favorite poets from that was a gentleman I'm sure many of you probably know, Amiri Baraka.
Of course, he helped to start our arts institution.
No, I'm kind of, yeah. But he, the critique of, he calls it the changing same. Right. And that sensibility that lingers over how we look at art and design and all of these things that what it kind of means to be human. So this is me and him. I was the first DJ to work with Amiri Baraka, and I did a series of projects around creating a poetry movement based on beats. And there was, in the 90s, you had Nuyorican Poets Cafe in New York. I was doing a whole bunch of parties and events. And I worked with Allen Ginsberg as well. And we would have some chats about this, of like, what was the difference between the 60s generation of political activism and the 90s and 2000s? And one of Amiri Baraka's kind of feelings was like, you got all this hip hop is repeating. Everybody's repeating everything. And so we did a collaboration where I did a remix of Black Dot and Neolismus. If you haven't heard it, it's a very beautiful song. But, each generation passes the torch, and I think that we need to think about non-linear. I mean, I don't think that anything is going to just be moving in one direction right now. It's going to be in many, many directions simultaneously.
Well, speaking of Baraka, actually, I'm the co-founder of an arts institution in Oakland. It's called the Eastside Arts Alliance, and the folks who kind of helped found us included Baraka, but also Bobby Seale, Sonia Sanchez, Malaquias Montoya, really the front of the guard of the third world movements, right? Whether it was the Black Arts Movement or the Chicano Arts Movement. But something they really taught us was that because of COINTELPRO and because of 80s, Reaganism, that a lot of our cultural institutions were dismantled. And so we didn't inherit, there was so much, the Black theater, there was so much institutions that we did not inherit. Well, my generation didn't inherit, and so Amiri helped us really think about what it meant to have a permanent presence. And that's why we bought our building. We ended up buying a building in East Oakland on International Boulevard, which is like the heart of the Deep East, precisely because they had lived through COINTELPRO. They had lived through the complete destruction of an ecosystem. And, I remember just what Amiri would talk to us about. And interestingly, I saw this on the Nina Simone video. Nina Simone, in her documentary, it became clear that, she didn't have health insurance. and that even though that she was doing so much powerful work, that the movement wasn't necessarily taking care of her. And so when we created the Eastside Arts Alliance as a place for artists, we wanted to lead with artists being in control of our institutions and also making sure that we had the resources for the long term, because so often in social justice spaces, I think artists are used. We're exploited. We're seen as a decorative element. You know, come to my fundraiser or come, you know, do this thing. It's a very transactional relationship, and yet as a movement, we don't fight for the arts. You know, and since Reagan, you know, we had here a question about mental health. I think it's really interesting that Reagan, who started the war on drugs and who really changed the definition of mental health and created a crisis in our country and eliminated, really gutted the NEA, right? And so just this kind of right-wing strategy of both creating the beginnings of mass incarceration and stigmatizing mental health and being in denial about AIDS and really doing such damage to our arts infrastructure that we have never recovered. We have never recovered. And even to this day, I think it's so interesting to me, you know, because I fight for, of course, many issues. But I ask myself, why are we not fighting for the arts? The arts is such a critical part of being a critical thinker. And, you know, Amiri was so instrumental in really reminding us of the power of art, but also in the power of creating our institutions.
Well, and so let's talk about this idea, because I really think it's a powerful notion right now that did we recover from arts or did we evolve? Because I think if you look at what happened with the arts, America's experienced an incredible renaissance right now of arts, mainly from technology and the way kids have taken and I think repurposed the makers movement. People have made independent stuff at every level. I don't know if for example, Kickstarter or Indiegogo, all these kind of new financial models, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, there's a tremendous amount of innovation churning, but it's not official. That's what's so fascinating. It's
but you know what also? It's actually, we're in the age where artists are the poorest they have ever been. I mean, the median income for artists is $30,000, which is $15 an hour, which is a minimum wage job. Not just that, the 7 out of the 10 most expensive schools in this country are art schools. So we have, and you have counties like LAUSD, LA Unified, that has eliminated arts and is one of the most multiracial. So I actually think that the arts has become that we're in a very dangerous place where unless we begin to look at equity in the arts, because yes, there's technology, but as a fundamental right, I think that kids, especially young people of color, are not having the access. And I also think that, you know, we have mass incarceration to deal with, we have racial justice to deal with, so of course people are like, the arts, eh. But to me, the art is about critical thinking and the ability for people to tell their own stories. Mm-hmm. You know, so I feel that although there is a renaissance, the inequality of it is just, it's the worst, it's the worst that we've seen.
Okay, so from that point of view, and there are some questions here. I want to make sure to we kind of answered the mental. There was some people, just by way of recapping, some people from the web were like, any thoughts about trauma, mental health, plus creative expression? Ditto, we already got that. All right, and then talking about the logo of a nation, how do you as artists reconcile patriotism and cultural identity with resistance, social change? Okay.
I can start with this a little bit. So first, I think that artists are about breaking binaries. And for me, like, you know, there's so many binaries, right? Virgin, slut. I love that binary, right? Because I feel like it's such a problematic binary. I grew up thinking that I had to be a virgin, and then
I think that's a punk band at this point. Right.
And then, of course, there's the binary of black versus white, because we live in a country that, because of racism, it's forcing us to just think in black and white terms, and it disappears everyone else. It disappears complexity. So it makes us forget that Latinx people are also black. It makes us forget that we live in a very mixed race society, and frankly, you know, like Native Americans, for example, are completely invisibilized. So I feel, and then you have, of course, the gender binary, which is a total problem. So for me also, I think patriotism, and when we think about the concept of a nation, I think that the concept of a nation is a story that we are all attached to, that is also, it can be dissolved. Borders they are very highly militarized zones, but they also can be very porous. And so for me as an artist, I like to really question the ways the narratives that we've inherited and really kind of turn them inside out and think about, well, what does a world without borders look like, right? Or what does a world without, you know, the gender binary look like? Or even, how do we embrace complexity? That's what I love as an artist, is complexity. And so I you know, when I think of patriotism, I mean, I don't know. I don't even know what to really do with that.
Okay.
With the concept of patriotism.
So my riff on that would be, there's an essential kind of evolution that's going on where corporations are more powerful than nation states. If you look at the kind of basic infrastructure of what's going on with Apple or ExxonMobil or whatever, they have more money than most nation states on this planet. And the you know, Google and the sheer volume of information generated by an average person every day far outweighs almost anything normal nation states are capable of dealing with. So the eerie thing is, as we move further into the 21st century, was Marx right? Will we see a withering of the state? And there was a, we got 10 minutes left. We're getting this kind of, this is like the new internet. Like we just
I
get
know,
like
I love this. This is analog.
Right. It's very. So when Karl Marx was thinking about this idea that the nation state would wither away because of the rise of the worker, is it the creative worker? Is it the artist worker? What kind of work? These are questions I'm using as provocations, and I don't necessarily say I'm here to offer any answers, by the way. But from my point of view, when I'm working on my film projects or when I'm working on my contemporary art projects, I wanted to show you a quick project I'm doing based on, not this gentleman, but I've already done a project around Paul Robeson. This is a very famous film called Body and Soul that I produced called Pioneers of African American Cinema. And I work with Library of Congress and the Museum of Modern Art to go through and find the first films made by African American directors. And I was the executive producer of this. And I did it, I'm also artist in residence at Stanford, so that's the Stanford Computer Science Department. But I always chuckle about when you see scale, like this is the size of our galaxy, this is the Milky Way, we all get that pattern. I think it's an implicit, we're talking about logo. But if we then go from that to another specific pattern, I'm going to show you something. Remember this symbol, and then you see this, you know? And you have storms and weather and climate that actually has radically changed the way we're living right now. They're the same morphology, you know? So once you start thinking about pattern recognition in culture, you reach into the pattern and you can transform it. And you can even see another pattern that's at the core of what it means to be identity of the human, and that's a fingerprint. And you can easily see the same pattern at work. So Alan Turing is considered generally to be the father of modern computing. He was gay, a man who was persecuted to death. And I based my last exhibition on his work, mainly from the viewpoint of taking his equations and turning them into a series of algorithmic prints that were able to work with sound and image. So that was with Greg Niermeyer from Berkeley University's Digital Media Department. So when you say logo, I'm thinking more and more it's about the patterns that we can potentially manifest that we haven't. And some people ask you, what's your greatest fear? And I always say, well, it's about unfulfilled potential. Like there's so many people, everyone in this room, woman, male, heterosexual, gay, whatever. I'm a heterosexual African-American male from DuPont Circle, which is already a paradox, and I'll leave it at that. But you know, when you start thinking about the history and legacy of so many of the things that just, you know, kind of are on you just from day one, from jump, is there an issue of free will? Is there a notion that the nation state, the way it conditions your subjectivity, how does that affect your just getting out of bed in the morning? You know, I mean, it's just, I mean, I think this is for my own film project, and I was talking about the 40 acres and a mule issue that came up after the Civil War with Birth of a Nation. And I was like, you know, the real reality right now is that everyone is a sharecropper just trying to pay their credit card bill. And so the nation state and the corporate, no, seriously, think about it. If you have $10 in your pocket and you don't have any debt, you have more money than most Americans. Now, think about that. It's a statistical model of 300 million people just on a gerbil wheel trying to pay their credit card bill. And that could generate a lot of electricity, actually. You could just see people, you know. So I always think that every angle, there's another angle. So why, if you have 360 degrees, why not add 361, 362? And these are issues that, you know, that linger in my mind as an artist. And so we were talking about remoteness. Lately, I've been setting up a studio in Colorado, and yeah, just because New York has a very deep gravitational well. It's like a city that just, once you're in New York, it just won't let you go. So I'm trying to figure out, how does the city affect the creative act? And this is a question I'm asking myself. Again, it's something that just lingers in my process. So I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, well, can I rip on this
okay,
though?
sure.
Because I've actually found it interesting that I spent a lot of time in one of the largest cities in the world, which is Mexico City. And I just have recently realized in understanding the effects of the destruction that we're doing to the planet, I really began to tap into how much I didn't grow up with a connection to the natural world. And that could be because, my parents just worked too hard and camping was just not something we did, or just I didn't have a relationship. But the more that I learn, the more that I want to be in a place of nature and contemplation, just to also reconnect, with my own humanity. So I've just noticed that I'm totally ready to get out of the city, out of the Oakland and just other cities, and go to a place where I can just experience this. And I think to myself, I grew up next to Marin, and the way that they have created land use laws so that we don't get to access, so many people of color don't get to access what is actually ours, what belongs to all of us, which is the commons, which is the redwoods, or just the beautiful landscape. So I'll try to connect it to this, I think.
I want to just like a tiny, little tiny intervention here is that, intriguing enough, it was the 19th century and the rise of nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and of course, Thoreau. The eerie thing about the American respect and engagement with nature comes out of poetry, comes out of the arts. But it was twisted and turned by someone like Hitler into a kind of counter movement against modernism. And you had this whole idea of what they called Entente Kunst and Entente Musik, which was that music and arts made by blacks or Jews or anyone who is involved with interdisciplinary or hybrid culture. Let me just show you some prints from that. Really fascinating, because nature in the German Nazi context was meant to be about purity. And so in the 1920s and 30s, they used that to kind of discredit multicultural art. And so the pure German, this was called Entente Kunst, arts made by people of color or Jews. And it was fascinating to go back through history and to see how one era's purity is another era's prosecution.
Well, but it's actually not if you talk about it in terms of the natural world thrives on biodiversity. So monoculture is never going to survive in the natural world, because monoculture is actually the death of what we're doing to the soil, right? And so for me, I really love to use this concept of biomimicry to understand that a white-led environmental movement is never going to work, because monoculture doesn't work, and you need biodiversity, meaning you need, in order to be a strong system that can withstand trauma, and whether that's trauma from the natural world, you need to be biodiverse. You need a diversity of experiences, of thought, of everything. So I'll try to connect to this last question, because I know we're running out of time. So how do we inspire young people? I am someone that I don't want to reproduce. I think I reproduce all the time with my artwork, so I've decided not to reproduce in the biological context. But for me, I think that working with young people, and I especially love to mentor young people of color, immigrants, and really open doors, just like people open doors for me. But I believe that, riffing on biomimicry, is that we're creating systems. We're creating approaches to life that are dynamic, they're biodynamic, they're not static. And so I really love to work with young people to really show them how in a changing landscape, when you have many different variables coming at you, how do you not just survive, but how do you thrive, right? How do you put yourself from a position of power and are able to really kind of be adaptive?
Okay, so this is probably a last question, and it says, will the racism that comes through your version of Birth of a Nation make me as mad as the original version, or will it be a different experience? So that's a little, like as Jay-Z would say, little on your shoulder. So I'm going to just kind of wrap with this one as a kind of a sense of, let me process before I get into that one. All right, there are no maps for this territory. That's my motto. And we make the landscape as we go, in a way. So in the crisis between the way we're now not just talking about nature, because we actually are in what you call an Anthropocene era, where human choices and decisions have impacted on nature beyond anything in the history of this planet, except being hit by a meteorite. They call it the sixth extinction. We are the sixth extinction for most other species on the planet. But eerily enough, 99% of most species go extinct in the history of the world. So if you have a couple billion years, the statistical probability of our species lasting, so the Earth will be here, we might not be. So that might be a profound statement about just how minuscule of a speck of dust we are in the history of this planet. Our species, as we know it, has only been around about 200,000 years, and 10,000 years of civilization. What happened
We fucked it up.
No, but what happened to the other 190,000? So these are things that linger in my mind because we always think about history and we think about dynamics and we think about patterns. And to me, it's really important when we say racism. Race is a fiction. At the end of the day, genetically speaking, we are all from a similar backdrop. And so the fictions that, say for example, if I'm in Germany, I just flew here from Germany, the Germans had issues with the French has issues with the English, everybody hates the Germans, etc. But when they come here, they're white, So there's a very famous book by Nell Pinter called The History of White People at Princeton University. And she talks about the construction of these fictions of race. They were used to consolidate power, as we all know. Raw power is based on making people feel segmented and siloed. So those are issues that I think linger, and what we're doing tonight is breaking those silos down. And so when I say, when you ask, will the racism that comes through your version of The Birth of a Nation, I would say, I'm going to wrap this one up with one of my favorite quotes, because I think it's important to sample and to remix and kind of use these as inspirations and stepping stones. And one of my favorite ones, this comes from a conversation between two of my favorite scientists, artists, philosophers. And this is Einstein in conversation with Rabindranath Tagore. Einstein was in the middle of finishing up his general theory of relativity, and he had a writer's block. So he had won the Nobel Prize, and Rabindranath Tagore had just also been the first Indian to win the Nobel Prize. And he was basing his poetry on Sanskrit mathematics. So Einstein called him and said, hey man, let's have a conversation. So they had a conversation, much like what we're doing, and they called it On the Nature of Reality. And if you have a free plane ride or you have a couple hours, it's a really good conversation because they're talking about Eastern versus Western concepts and math, and why the West, actually amusingly enough, the West didn't have zero. For up until Fibonacci, who's in the 12th century as a mathematician, who actually appropriated from the Arabs, who appropriated from the Indians.
And the Mayans.
Well, they didn't have, okay, that's a remix, but in general, the Indians usually had the concept of zero way before everybody else, and they used that to create an entire spectrum of experiences about multiplicity, multiple universes, multiple worlds, multiple lives. And we're now just catching up with that with quantum physics. And there's people like Brian Greene, who wrote this book, The Elegant Universe. He has a theory of infinite parallel universes. So we change things as we perceive them. This is what they call Schrodinger's paradox or the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, all of which is the math of perception. So when I think about racism, I'm like, that's like super, it's so minuscule compared to the history of this planet and the history of our time, but we need to also be as vital in the present as we can be. So that's why we're in this room. And I just want to say, I know time-wise we should probably wrap up, but again, just going back to this one gentleman, Coltrane, and his use of mathematics as well, the basis of jazz, the basis of so many of the musics that we think, it's all math. Geometry is math. Math is music. So one of my favorite, and this is the last thing, is to say that it's just about pattern recognition and being able to reach into the patterns of our time, our society, our world, and change them. So this is where my favorite gentleman, Einstein, likes to say, he says, logic will get you from A to B, the imagination will take you everywhere. So thanks for coming out tonight.